My name is Alicia, and at 67 years old, I never thought my only son would break my heart so publicly. I had saved $19,000 over 5 years to give James the wedding of his dreams. Every extra shift, every skipped vacation, all worth it to see him happy. But when he grabbed that microphone at the reception, looked right past me, and thanked his grandmother as his real mother, I felt my world collapse. I stood frozen as 300 pairs of eyes turned to me in that deadly silence. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you are watching from today and hit that subscribe button if you have ever felt betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for. I was only 22 when I had James. His father, Mark, and I had been high school sweethearts, but 3 months after James was born, Mark was killed in a construction accident. Just like that, I became a widow and a single mother before I could even legally buy a drink. We had no insurance, no savings, and suddenly I was alone with a tiny baby who had his father's eyes. Those early years were a blur of exhaustion. I worked at a diner during the day, while my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, watched James. At night, I took accounting classes at the community college. I would study after putting James to bed, often falling asleep with my face in a textbook. There were nights I cried silently in the bathroom because I was so tired, but I never let James see that. To him, I was always smiling, always strong. By the time James started kindergarten, I had my accounting certificate and found a job at a small local firm. It paid better than the diner, but still barely enough. I remember cutting my own hair to save money for James to join Little League. His uniform cost $80, which was our entire grocery budget for 2 weeks. We ate a lot of pasta those weeks, but seeing him proud in that uniform made it worthwhile. We had our special traditions. Every Sunday was pancake day, where I would let James mix the batter and choose shapes. Sometimes they looked more like blobs than dinosaurs or cars, but we would laugh until our sides hurt. On his birthday, no matter how tight money was, I would take him to one special place he chose. When he was 7, we saved for 6 months so we could go to Disney World. I worked overtime for weeks to afford it, but I will never forget his face when he saw the castle. Margaret, my mother-in-law, stayed somewhat distant during those early years. She and Mark's father, Harold, lived 3 hours away, and they would send birthday and Christmas presents, but visits were rare. I think seeing James reminded Margaret too painfully of Mark. But when James turned 10, Harold passed away and something changed in Margaret. She suddenly wanted to be involved in our lives. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Margaret would take James for weekends, buy him things I could never afford, and tell him stories about his father. I was grateful James could know that part of his heritage. Margaret had money from Harold's insurance and pension, plus their large house was paid off. When she offered to help with James's private school tuition when he reached middle school, I reluctantly accepted. I wanted him to have every opportunity. That was when I started noticing subtle changes. James would come home from weekend visits, with Margaret comparing our small apartment unfavorably to her large house. He started asking for expensive clothes like the kids at his new school wore. When I explained we couldn't afford them, he would say Grandma Margaret would buy them for me. By the time he was 14, James was spending most school breaks at Margaret's house. She had converted a room specially for him with a gaming setup I could never provide. When he was home with me, he seemed restless, always texting his friends or asking when he could go back to Grandma's. Our pancake Sundays became less frequent, then stopped altogether. In high school, James joined the debate team and excelled. I never missed a competition, sitting in those uncomfortable auditorium chairs bursting with pride. Margaret attended too, always dressed impeccably in designer clothes, bringing her friends to watch her grandson. Sometimes people assumed she was his mother, and I was. Who the aunt? The family friend. It stung, but I stayed silent. When James got accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, I was ecstatic. Margaret immediately offered to cover the remaining tuition. I wanted to contribute, so I took a second job doing bookkeeping for local businesses on weekends. It meant I couldn't visit him as often as Margaret did, but I called every Sunday night without fail. During his sophomore year, James met Amanda. She came from a wealthy Chicago family, her father, a successful surgeon, and her mother, a former model turned interior designer. The first time James brought her home during spring break, I noticed how she looked around our modest home with barely concealed disdain. When they visited Margaret the next day, he returned gushing about how Amanda loved Margaret's house and how they had so much in common. After college graduation, James proposed to Amanda. When they announced their engagement at Margaret's elaborate Thanksgiving dinner, everyone cheered. James looked at me and said, "Mom, I hope you're happy for us." "Not Mom. I want you to be the first to know, or Mom, your blessing means everything." It was an afterthought. Still, when they began discussing wedding plans, I immediately offered to pay. It was tradition, after all, and I had been saving since James started college. I had $19,000 set aside, a fortune for me. Every birthday check I had received, every tax refund, every small bonus had gone into that account. I told James I wanted to give him the wedding he deserved. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked, looking surprised. "It's going to be quite elaborate. Amanda has very specific ideas." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I've been saving for this day since you were born." What I didn't tell him was that this money was also my retirement cushion. At 67, I was still working full-time with no plans to stop because my savings were modest. This wedding would take everything, but I thought it would be worth it to cement my place in my son's life, to prove my love in a way he couldn't ignore. I was so wrong. As soon as I committed to paying for the wedding, Amanda went into full planning mode. What had initially been described as a modest ceremony with around 100 guests quickly evolved into an extravaganza. The guest list expanded to 300 people, most of whom I had never met. The venue changed from a charming local garden to an exclusive country club that charged a $5,000 booking fee alone. "It's what we always envisioned," James explained, when I expressed concern about the mounting costs. "Amanda's parents would help, but they're already paying for the honeymoon in Bali." I nodded and smiled, even as I mentally calculated how many extra clients I would need to take on. That night, I called 3 of my weekend bookkeeping clients and asked if they needed additional hours. I also reached out to my old diner and asked if they needed help on Sundays. At my age, being on my feet for 8-hour shifts was exhausting, but I told myself it was temporary. Just 6 months until the wedding. The first wedding planning meeting was at Amanda's parents' house, a sprawling Tudor-style home in the most expensive neighborhood in the city. I wore my best outfit, a navy blue pantsuit I had bought on sale 3 years ago for a company dinner. The moment I walked in, I felt underdressed. Amanda's mother, Sylvia, wore casual designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Margaret was already there, dressed similarly, chatting with Sylvia, like old friends. "Alicia, you finally made it," Margaret said, checking her watch. "I was actually 5 minutes early, according to the invitation." "Sorry if I kept everyone waiting," I said, taking the only remaining seat, a hard chair slightly apart from the plush sofa where the others Saturday. For the next 2 hours, Amanda discussed flower arrangements, table settings, and color schemes. Whenever I offered a suggestion, there would be a brief pause. Then Amanda would continue as if I hadn't spoken. Once I mentioned that lilies had been my wedding flower, thinking James might like that connection to his father. "Oh, lilies are so funeral," Sylvia said with a laugh. "Amanda's thinking peonies and orchids, aren't you, dear?" "Absolutely," Margaret chimed in. "Mark always loved orchids." I bit my tongue. Mark had been allergic to orchids, a fact Margaret should have known. But contradicting her would only create tension. As the weeks passed, I found myself increasingly sidelined in the planning process. Decisions were made in group texts that somehow excluded me, then presented as fait accompli when I inquired. The venue deposit was $5,000 non-refundable. The flowers were $3,000. The photographer, another $2,000. Each time I wrote checks until my savings account dwindled alarmingly. 3 months before the wedding, I got a call from James on my lunch break. "Mom, I'm at Frederick's formal with Grandma Margaret. We found the perfect tux, but it's a bit out of the normal rental range." How much, I asked, already dreading the answer. $2,000 to purchase. But it's designer, and I can use it for other events. I closed my eyes, thinking of the electricity bill I had yet to pay. James, we discussed renting. "I know, but Grandma thinks it's worth investing in a good tux. Actually, she offered to pay for it, but I told her you wanted to handle all the wedding expenses." The manipulation was so transparent it hurt. "Put Margaret on the phone, please." A moment later, Margaret's smooth voice came through. "Alicia, you should see him in this tuxedo. It's exactly what Mark would have wanted for his son." "Margaret, we agreed the budget was for rentals. I can't afford $2,000 for a tux he'll wear once." Well, her voice took on that condescending tone I had grown to hate. "I suppose I could contribute this one thing if you're struggling financially." The implication was clear. I couldn't provide properly for my son. Swallowing my pride, I said, "No, put James back on." When James returned to the phone, I told him to buy the tux. Another dent in my rapidly depleting savings. The final straw came when I discovered that Margaret had gone with Amanda to select her wedding dress, a $5,000 designer gown. I had been told the appointment was the following week. When confronted, James shrugged it off. "Mom, it just worked out that Grandma was free that day, and you were working. Amanda didn't want to wait. I would have taken the day off, James. I've been waiting your whole life to help choose your bride's wedding dress." "Well, it's done now," he said impatiently, and Grandma put down the deposit as her gift to Amanda. That night I finally broke down and called my oldest friend Susan. "She's trying to replace me," I sobbed. "She's taking every special moment, and James is letting her." "Have you talked to him about how you feel?" Susan asked gently. I hadn't. Not really. The next day I invited James for coffee, just the two of us. At the local diner where I used to work, I tried to explain my feelings. "I feel like I'm being pushed out of your wedding, James. Out of your life, even." He looked uncomfortable. "Mom, that's ridiculous. You're my mother." Then why was Margaret at the dress appointment instead of me? Why does she know about plans before I do when I'm the one paying? James's expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. Grandma Margaret has been there for me consistently my whole life. She has been involved in every aspect of my upbringing. "I have been there every day of your life, James. I worked 3 jobs when you were little, so you could have everything you needed." And I appreciate that he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "But Grandma Margaret gave me opportunities you couldn't. The private school, the college visits, the connections for my first job." I stared at my son, this stranger across the table. "Those things cost money, yes. But who packed your lunches every day? Who sat up with you when you had the flu? Who drove you to practice and helped with homework and kissed your scraped knees?" "This isn't a competition, Mom," he said coldly. I'm not going to rank who did more for me. The fact is, both of you are important, but you seem to have some issue with Grandma that's making you jealous." I felt like I had been slapped. Jealous. Of the woman who swooped in after I had done the hard work of raising a child alone. "I just want to be included," I said finally, fighting back tears. "You are included," he insisted. "You're paying for the wedding. That's a huge contribution." In that moment, I realized that to my son, my value was in my checkbook, not my heart, but I had come too far to back out. The final payment for the reception venue was due the following week, a staggering $7,000 that would empty my account completely. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner, which Margaret hosted at an expensive restaurant, James stopped by my hotel room. For a moment I saw a flash of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap with picture books. "Thanks for everything, Mom," he said, hugging me awkwardly. "I know the wedding got more expensive than we planned." "It's worth it," I said, hoping it was true. "I just want you to be happy." "I am happy," he assured me, "and tomorrow's going to be perfect." I believed him. I thought perhaps all the tension had been wedding stress, and after tomorrow we could rebuild our relationship. My son would see all I had sacrificed, and things would go back to the way they were. I went to bed, full of hope. I woke up at 5:30 on the morning of the wedding, too excited and nervous to sleep any longer. The ceremony wasn't until 2 in the afternoon, but I wanted plenty of time to get ready. I had splurged on a hair appointment at 9, and a makeup session after that, the first professional beauty treatments I had gotten in years. After a quick breakfast in my hotel room, I called James's room to wish him good morning. No answer. I tried his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Figuring he was probably still asleep, I decided to text him instead. "Good morning. So excited for your big day. Love you so much." While getting dressed to head to my hair appointment, I received a text back, but not from James. It was from Margaret. "James is getting ready at my house. The groomsmen are all here. Don't worry about him." I stared at the message, feeling that familiar pang. Another moment taken from me. I had imagined helping my son prepare for his wedding day, straightening his tie, maybe sharing a quiet moment of reflection about his father. Now that too was gone. At the salon, the hairdresser worked wonders with my gray-streaked brown hair, styling it in a way that made me look years younger. The makeup artist covered the dark circles under my eyes, evidence of months of extra work and stress. Looking in the mirror afterward, I hardly recognized myself. I looked elegant, put together. For once, I wouldn't seem out of place next to Margaret and Amanda's family. The ceremony was being held at St. Michael's Cathedral, a beautiful historic church in the heart of downtown. When I arrived at noon, the wedding coordinator, a brisk young woman named Tiffany, directed me to a small anteroom. "The mother of the groom can wait here until the procession," she said, checking something off her clipboard. "The bridal party is using the main dressing rooms." I had expected to at least see James before the ceremony, but when I asked Tiffany, informed me that he was in final preparations with the groomsmen and his grandmother. "His grandmother?" I asked, confused. "Yes, Mrs. Wade insisted on helping with the boutonnieres." Tiffany looked uncomfortable. She said she was essentially his mother figure. I sat alone in that small room for nearly an hour, scrolling through old photos of James on my phone. Baby James, on his first birthday face, covered in cake. 8-year-old James missing his front teeth. Teenage James in his debate team blazer. My beautiful boy whom I had raised alone, who was now allowing another woman to claim my role. At 1:45, Tiffany returned to escort me to my seat. To my surprise, I wasn't being seated in the front row traditionally reserved for parents of the bride and groom. Instead, I was directed to the second row behind where Margaret was already sitting in the position meant for me. "There must be a mistake," I whispered to Tiffany. "I'm the mother of the groom." Tiffany looked at her seating chart again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Nelson, but this is the arrangement approved by the bride and groom." Too embarrassed to make a scene, I took my assigned seat. The elderly usher gave me a sympathetic look as he handed me a program. Flipping through it, I noticed that in the section thanking family members for their support, Margaret was listed as James's loving grandmother, who has been like a mother to him. My name appeared only in the standard listing of parents. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I have to admit. The cathedral had been transformed with thousands of dollars worth of flowers and candles, all paid for by me. When the music started and the bridal party began their procession, I craned my neck to see past the people in front of me. And then James appeared looking so handsome in that expensive tuxedo, so much like his father that my heart ached. He walked confidently, escorting Margaret down the aisle before taking his place at the altar. I hadn't known he would be walking her down the aisle. Another tradition that should have included me, another moment stolen. Amanda was radiant in her designer gown as her father proudly walked her down the aisle. I watched my son's face as he saw his bride, the pure joy there momentarily, making me forget all the hurt. In that moment, he was just my little boy grown up and finding love. I wiped away tears, telling myself they were entirely tears of happiness. The ceremony went smoothly. The couple had written their own vows, and James's were surprisingly emotional, speaking of building a family and honoring traditions. I wondered which traditions he meant, since he had abandoned so many of ours. After the ceremony, while the wedding party took photos, I found myself standing awkwardly alone. Amanda's extended family clustered together, chatting animatedly. I recognized a few of James's friends from college, but they were busy with their own conversations. Eventually, I spotted an old neighbor, Mrs. Winters, who had watched James occasionally when he was in elementary school. "Elisha." "The ceremony was lovely," she said warmly. "You must be so proud." "I am," I agreed, grateful for the friendly face. "Though I feel a bit out of place, to be honest." Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "I noticed you weren't seated in the front row. I thought that was odd. Apparently that's how James and Amanda wanted it," I said, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "Well, that's not right," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "After everything you did for that boy." Her validation meant more than she could know. For months I had wondered if I was overreacting, if my feelings of being replaced were just insecurity. Hearing someone else acknowledge the slight made me feel less crazy. The reception was held at the Grand Reserve, the exclusive country club that had cost $7,000 just to book. Walking into the ballroom, even I was impressed by the transformation. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables covered in silk cloths. Centerpieces of orchids and peonies towered elegantly. A 7-piece band played softly as guests found their seats. My table assignment was another slight. Rather than being at the head table with the wedding party, or even at a prominent family table, I was seated at table 11 near the back, with some of Amanda's distant relatives and a couple of James's work colleagues who looked barely out of college. As dinner was served, I made polite conversation with my table mates, none of whom seemed to realize I was the groom's mother. Across the room I could see Margaret seated at table 1, laughing with Amanda's parents as if they were old friends. The meal was exquisite, I'll give them that. 5 courses of gourmet food that probably cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a week. I barely tasted any of it, my stomach too knotted with anxiety about what was to come. After dinner, the master of ceremonies announced it was time for speeches. Amanda's father went first, a charming speech about welcoming James to the family. Then Amanda's maid of honor, followed by James's best friend from college, who told embarrassing stories that had everyone laughing. And then it was James's turn. My son, my only child, took the microphone and stepped to the center of the dance floor. The room quieted as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today to celebrate Amanda and me," he started. "This day wouldn't be possible without the love and support of our families." I felt myself relax slightly. Maybe he would acknowledge me now, thank me publicly for making this lavish day possible. "I want to thank Amanda's parents, Robert and Sylvia, for raising such an amazing woman and for welcoming me into your family." James continued, raising his glass to them. And then he turned slightly his eyes, finding Margaret at her front row table. "And I especially want to thank my real mother," he said clearly into the microphone, "the woman who has truly been there for me in all the ways that matter." He was pointing directly at Margaret, who beamed with tears in her eyes. "Grandma Margaret, you stepped in when I needed guidance and support. You showed me what I could become and helped me get there. Your love has shaped me into the man I am today. This day is as much for you as it is for us." The room was dead silent. 300 people turned in their seats looking for my reaction. I felt the blood drain from my face as the room seemed to tilt around me. 22 years of single motherhood, of scraped knees and parent-teacher conferences, of working multiple jobs and going without, all erased with a single sentence, "My real mother." My real mother. The words echoed in my head as if James had shouted them, though his voice had been clear and deliberate. Not a slip of the tongue, not a mistake, but a conscious choice to publicly deny me. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed under an enormous weight. The faces around me blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not break down in front of these strangers, these witnesses to my humiliation. James was still speaking, but I could no longer hear the words over the roaring in my ears. I watched his mouth move, saw the proud smile on his face as he looked at Margaret, who was dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She caught my gaze across the room and had the audacity to give me a small apologetic shrug, as if to say, "What can you do? He chose me." Around me, Amanda's relatives were whispering, glancing between me and Margaret with undisguised curiosity. A woman across the table, whose name I had already forgotten, reached over to touch my hand. "Are you all right?" she whispered. I nodded mechanically, my face frozen in what I hoped resembled a smile. "Fine," I managed to say through lips that felt numb. The room erupted in applause as James finished his speech, raising his glass in a final toast to his real mother. Margaret stood to receive a hug from my son, who had just denied 19 years of my sacrifice in front of everyone who mattered to him. And suddenly I was back in our tiny first apartment, holding baby James at 3 a.m. as he screamed with colic, bouncing and shushing him while tears of exhaustion streamed down my face. No one had been there to help me then. No one had been there when I sat in hospital waiting rooms terrified as he got stitches or had his tonsils out. No one had been there for the science projects and the nightmares and the driver's ed lessons. I remembered how I had worked through a fever to finish a client's books, because we needed the money for James's senior trip. How I had sold my mother's antique brooch, the only heirloom I had to pay for his prom expenses. How I had sat alone in this very dress at his college graduation because Margaret had taken the seats in the family section. And now, after giving him everything, including my entire life savings, he stood in this room full of people and called another woman his real mother. I realized with startling clarity that I had been erased, not just today, but systematically over years, as Margaret had inserted herself into every milestone, every achievement, claiming credit for the man James had become. And worse, James had let her. Had participated willingly in the fiction that she, not I, was the central maternal figure in his life. The band began to play again, and people returned to their conversations. The moment had passed for everyone except me. I sat rigid in my chair, uncertain what to do next. Part of me wanted to flee, to run from this beautiful room that had cost me everything. Another part wanted to march up to that microphone and tell every person present the truth about the sacrifices I had made. I did neither. Instead, I excused myself from the table and walked steadily to the restroom, back straight, head high. Once inside a stall, I pressed my forehead against the cool metal door and finally allowed the tears to come muffling my sobs with my hand. After several minutes, I heard the bathroom door open and froze, trying to quiet my breathing. "Alicia, are you in here?" It was Susan, my oldest friend, who had witnessed the whole horrible scene. "Honey, please come out." I unlocked the stall door, knowing I must look a mess mascara, streaking down my face despite the makeup artist's promises of waterproof products. Susan pulled me into a hug. "I can't believe he did that to you. I want to wring that boy's neck." I gave him everything, I whispered. "Everything." "I know you did." Susan handed me a wad of tissues, "And he's an ungrateful brat who doesn't deserve you. Do you want me to take you home?" I considered it. How easy it would be to disappear, to leave this nightmare behind. But then they would all know how deeply they had hurt me. Margaret would comfort James, telling him his mother had always been emotionally unstable, too sensitive. It would only cement their narrative. "No," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I'm staying." "Are you sure no one would blame you for leaving?" I paid for every flower, every bite of food, every note of music, I said with newfound determination. "I'm going to be here to see what my $19,000 bought." Susan helped me fix my makeup, and together we returned to the reception. The party was in full swing now, with people dancing and drinking. James was moving from table to table, with Amanda greeting guests. He was working his way around the room methodically, and I realized he would eventually have to come to my table. I watched him, this handsome stranger in an expensive tux, and tried to reconcile him with the little boy who had once cried when I had a haircut because I looked different. When had he become so cold, so calculating? Or had Margaret's influence over the years gradually eroded his ability to see the truth of who had really been there for him? When James and Amanda finally reached my table, his smile faltered slightly. Had he expected me to have left? Was he hoping for it? "Mom," he said, the word sounding hollow after what he had declared publicly. "Great party, right?" "Lovely," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "Everything you wanted, I hope." Amanda, perhaps sensing the tension, jumped in. "We're so grateful for everything, Alicia. The venue is amazing." She called me Alicia, not Mom, or even Mrs. Nelson, another small cut. $19,000 buys quite a venue, I said pleasantly. Every penny I had saved. James had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mom, let's not talk about money tonight." "When should we talk about it, James? Before or after you publicly disowned me?" A flash of anger crossed his face. "I didn't disown you. Don't be dramatic. You called another woman, your real mother, in front of 300 people," I said, keeping my voice low but intense. "What would you call it?" "Grandma Margaret has been like a mother to me," he insisted. "You're always working, always busy. She's the one who's been consistently present." The unfairness of this statement was breathtaking. "I worked to support us, James, to give you everything you needed." "We should circulate," Amanda interrupted, tugging at James's arm. "My uncle is trying to get your attention." James looked relieved at the excuse to escape. "We'll talk later, Mom," he said, already turning away. But we didn't talk later. For the remainder of the evening, James skillfully avoided being alone with me. During the mother-son dance, a tradition I had looked forward to for years, the DJ announced a change of plans. James will now share a special dance with his grandmother, Margaret Wade. I watched from my distant table as my son twirled his real mother around the dance floor to wind beneath my wings. The final insult, the final erasure. As the night drew to a close, I made no attempt to say goodbye to the newlyweds. What was there to say? James had made his choice long ago, it seemed. I had just been too blind to see it. I drove home alone, my fancy dress and professional makeup, a costume that had failed to transform me into someone my son could publicly acknowledge. In my rearview mirror, I could see the hotel where the reception had been held, growing smaller lights, blazing as the celebration continued without me. At home, I kicked off my uncomfortable shoes and sat in the dark of my living room, surrounded by photos of a life that apparently meant nothing to the person who mattered most. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel not just hurt but anger, pure, righteous anger, at the injustice of what had happened. My phone pinged with a text from James heading off to honeymoon. "Thanks again for everything." Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a casual thanks, as if I had given him a gift card, not my entire savings and a lifetime of love. That's when I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue to be the doormat that James and Margaret wiped their feet on. If my son wanted to pretend I wasn't his real mother, perhaps it was time I showed him exactly what that meant. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with swollen eyes and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet, just as it had been for the past decade since James left for college. But today the silence felt different, final somehow. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where I had helped James with homework, where we had eaten thousands of meals together. My phone showed several missed calls and texts from concerned friends who had witnessed yesterday's humiliation. Susan had called 3 times. I wasn't ready to talk yet. Around noon, my phone rang again. Margaret. I stared at her name on the screen, debating whether to answer. Curiosity won out. "Hello, Margaret," I said coolly. "Alicia," she began, her voice carrying that false warmth I had grown to despise. "I wanted to check on you. You left the reception rather early. Did I miss anything?" Another speech about how you're James's real mother, perhaps. She sighed as if I were being unreasonable. "I think you misunderstood what James meant. He was just acknowledging my role in his life. By explicitly calling you his real mother, that seems pretty clear to me." "Well," Margaret said, her tone shifting to one of condescension, "you have to admit you weren't always the most present mother. All those jobs you worked, all those hours away from home." The audacity took my breath away. "I worked to support us, Margaret. Some of us didn't have the luxury of a dead husband's pension." "There's no need to be crude," she sniffed. "I'm just saying that while you provided financially, I was the one who gave James the emotional support and guidance he needed. The cultural experiences, the connections. Is that what you've been telling him all these years? That I was just the paycheck, while you were the real parent?" "I never used those exact words," she said carefully. "But children are perceptive. James understood who was truly invested in his future." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "I have been invested in his future since the moment I knew I was pregnant. I have sacrificed everything for him." "Yes, and you never let him forget it, did you?" Margaret's voice turned cold. "Always the martyr, always reminding him of your sacrifices. Children resent that, Alicia. They want unconditional love, not a running tab of what they owe. The conversation was going nowhere. Margaret clearly believed her own narrative, the story she had constructed to justify her systematic replacement of me in my son's life. "I have to go," I said abruptly. "Of course," she replied smugly. "But Alicia, do try to be happy for James. This wedding was everything he wanted. You should be proud of what your contribution made possible." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. My contribution, as if I had donated to a charity rather than given my life savings for my son's happiness. And what had it bought me? A seat at table 11 and public humiliation. Later that afternoon, James texted me from the airport. "Boarding for Bali now. Sorry if things got weird yesterday. Grandma said you seemed upset." I stared at the text, marveling at its inadequacy. Weird? My son had publicly rejected me after taking every penny I had, and he called it weird. "Enjoy your honeymoon," I replied simply. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply he had wounded me, not through text where Margaret would likely read it too. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of normal life. I returned to work, smiled at colleagues who asked about the wedding, said all the expected things about how beautiful it had been. At night, I came home and methodically began removing photos of James from my walls. Not in anger, but in acceptance of reality. The son I thought I had did not exist. A week after the wedding, Susan insisted on coming over. She brought wine and takeout and listened as I finally poured out the whole story, not just of the wedding, but of the years of Margaret's subtle undermining James's growing distance, the gradual erasure of my role in his life. "Have you looked at his social media lately?" Susan asked hesitantly. I shook my head. I had never been much for social platforms, though I had a Facebook account I rarely checked. Susan pulled out her phone and navigated to James's Instagram account. There were dozens of wedding photos already posted. Photos of James with Amanda, with her parents, with Margaret, prominently featured in many shots. I appeared in exactly one, a group photo where I stood at the edge, barely in frame. But what truly stunned me were the captions. Under a photo of James and Margaret with the woman who raised me to be the man I am today. Another, from years earlier that I had never seen, showed James and Margaret at his college graduation. So grateful to have my real mom supporting me every step of the way. "This has been going on for years," I whispered, scrolling through post after post where Margaret was described as his mother, his rock, his everything. "He's been erasing me publicly for a long time." Alicia, Susan said gently, "I think you need to consider whether this relationship is healthy for you. You've given everything to James, and he's shown you how little he values that. What are you suggesting? That I cut off my own son?" "Not necessarily, but maybe it's time to focus on yourself for once, to rebuild your life without putting James at the center of it." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. For 27 years, every decision I had made had been with James in mind. What would it mean to live for myself? The next morning, I called my financial advisor, a luxury I had allowed myself when I started earning better money in my 50s. The news was as grim as I expected. "Alicia, you've depleted your main savings entirely," Jack said, reviewing my accounts. "You still have your 401 kelvins, but it's nowhere near enough for retirement, especially if you want to maintain your current lifestyle." "What are my options?" I asked. "Keep working as long as possible. Cut expenses. Maybe consider downsizing your home to free up some equity." I thought about my small 2-bedroom house, hardly a mansion, but the only real asset I owned. I had paid off the mortgage just 3 years ago, a moment of tremendous pride. The thought of selling it felt like yet another loss. "There is one other thing," Jack mentioned. "You said you paid for the wedding venue with a credit card before transferring money to cover it, right?" I nodded. "You might want to check the contract. Some of these high-end venues have clauses about partial refunds for certain services not used or for early departure. It's a long shot, but worth looking into." That afternoon, I dug out the venue contract from my files. Jack was right. There was a clause stating that if the reception ended before midnight, it had at 11:30, there would be a partial refund of $1,500 for unused service hours. It wasn't much compared to what I had spent, but it was something. I called the venue manager immediately and cited the clause. After some back and forth, she agreed that I was due the refund, but since the contract was in James's name, the check would be issued to him. "He authorized me to handle all payments," I explained. "I have copies of all the checks I wrote." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Nelson, but the contract holder is the only one who can receive the refund. Perhaps your son can deposit it and write you a check." I laughed bitterly at the thought. James, who had taken $19,000 without a second thought, voluntarily returning $1,500, unlikely. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a soft voice said, "Mrs. Nelson, this is Amanda." Surprised, I responded, "Amanda, is everything okay? Are you still on your honeymoon?" "Yes, we're still in Bali. It's beautiful here." She paused. "I'm calling because, well, I wanted to apologize for what happened at the reception, James's speech." I said nothing, waiting. "I didn't know he was going to say that," she continued. "I would have advised against it if I had known." "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but why are you calling me behind James's back?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw your face when he said those words, and because I've been noticing things about James and Margaret's relationship that concern me." Now she had my full attention. "What kind of things?" "The way she manipulates him, always comparing him to his father, telling him what Mark would have wanted. The way she inserts herself into our decisions." Another pause, and I found old emails where she told James, "You had said terrible things about me, about my family. Things I now realize you never said." I closed my eyes, pieces falling into place. "Margaret has been poisoning James against me for years." "I think so," Amanda agreed quietly. "I confronted James about it yesterday, and he got defensive. Said I didn't understand their special bond." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's wrong," she said simply, "and because I'm worried about what kind of influence she'll have if we have children. I don't want her playing these same games with my kids." After we hung up, I sat with this new information. Margaret had been more deliberate than I realized, actively lying to turn my son against me. The betrayal cut deep, but the revelation also gave me strength. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the systematic campaign to replace me. With renewed determination, I began to formulate a plan. Not for revenge exactly, but for justice. For reclaiming some small piece of what had been taken from me, both financially and emotionally. James and Margaret had made their choices. Now it was time to make mine. 2 weeks after the wedding, with James and Amanda still on their extended honeymoon, I scheduled appointments with 2 people, my financial advisor, Jack, and a lawyer named Patricia, who specialized in elder law and financial abuse cases. I wasn't sure if my situation qualified as abuse, but I needed expert advice. Jack confirmed what I already knew at 67, with no savings and inadequate retirement funds. I was in a precarious financial position. "You'll need to work at least 5 more years, Alicia, maybe longer." And even then you'll be living very modestly. What if I could recover some of the wedding money? I asked. He looked skeptical. Unless there was fraud involved, voluntary gifts are usually just that, voluntary. But any recovery would help your situation. Patricia, the lawyer, was more encouraging after hearing my story. The venue refund should rightfully come to you since you paid for the service. We can send a demand letter for that. As for the larger sum, she tapped her pen thoughtfully. There's a legal concept called detrimental reliance. Essentially, if James led you to believe your financial contribution would be acknowledged and respected, and you made financial decisions based on that understanding, you might have a case. I don't want to sue my son, I clarified. I just want what's fair. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough, Patricia said. Let me draft some letters, and we'll see how they respond. While Patricia worked on the legal angle, I turned my attention to documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet of every expense related to the wedding, complete with copies of checks and credit card statements. I compiled a timeline of events showing how I had been systematically excluded from wedding planning despite being the financial backer, and I wrote down every detail of what happened at the reception, including James's exact words when he called Margaret his real mother. I also began researching support groups for parents estranged from their adult children. I was shocked to discover how common my situation was, particularly with grandparents who used financial advantages to drive wedges between parents and children. I joined an online forum and found myself offering advice to others based on my painful experience. When James and Amanda returned from their honeymoon, I received a perfunctory text back home. Thanks again for everything. No suggestion of meeting up. No real acknowledgement of my role or the hurt I had experienced. That same day, the venue called to inform me they had issued the $1,500 refund check to James as required by the contract. I immediately texted him. The venue is refunding $1,500 for early closure. The check is in your name, but the money rightfully belongs to me as I paid for the venue. Hours passed without a response. Finally, my phone rang. James. Mom, he began, sounding irritated. I just got home from a 3-week trip, and immediately you're asking for money. It's not asking, I corrected him. That refund is from what I paid. I'm simply letting you know I expect you to forward the check to me. Actually, he said, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his tone. Grandma Margaret contributed to the venue cost. She gave me $2,000 in cash that I put toward the final payment. This was news to me. Did she? That's interesting because I have copies of all the payments and they came from my account. If Margaret gave you cash that you kept for yourself, that's between you and her. Why are you being like this? He demanded. It's just $1,500. Just $1,500. I repeated slowly. James, I emptied my entire savings account for your wedding. $19,000. Money that was supposed to help support me in retirement. No one asked you to spend that much, he shot back. You offered. Yes, I offered to pay for my only son's wedding because I love you. And then you stood up in front of everyone and called another woman your real mother. There was silence on the line. Then I knew you were still upset about that. Mom, it was just a figure of speech. Grandma Margaret has been like a mother to me in many ways. A figure of speech? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You specifically said my real mother and pointed at Margaret. There's no ambiguity there, James. You're overreacting as usual. His tone was dismissive. This is why I sometimes find it easier to talk to Grandma. She doesn't turn everything into a drama. Something snapped inside me. 27 years of putting James first, of excusing his behavior, of blaming myself for his distance, all ended in that moment. "I've had Patricia Gordon draw up some paperwork," I said calmly. "She's an attorney who specializes in financial elder abuse cases." What? James sounded genuinely shocked. "You're suing me, your own son." "I'm asking for what's fair, the venue refund at minimum, but she also thinks I have a strong case for recovering a significant portion of the wedding costs based on detrimental reliance." "This is insane," James sputtered. "I can't believe you'd do this." "I can't believe you'd publicly humiliate the mother who raised you alone and sacrificed everything for you," I countered. "But here we are." After a tense silence, James said, "Fine. I'll send you the refund check. But this changes things between us, Mom." "Things already changed, James. They changed the moment you decided I wasn't your real mother." After hanging up, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. For the first time in decades, I had stood up for myself, instead of trying to preserve James's feelings at all costs. The next day, I received an angry call from Margaret. "How dare you threaten to sue James after everything he's done for you?" I actually laughed. "What exactly has James done for me, Margaret? Please enlighten me." He's been a good son," she stammered. "He calls you, visits you. Rarely, and usually when he needs something. And what have you done, Margaret, besides systematically undermining my relationship with my son for 20 years? "That's ridiculous," she protested. "I've only ever supported James. By telling him I said terrible things about Amanda, by taking credit for his accomplishments, by positioning yourself as his real mother." There was a telling pause. "Who told you I said anything about Amanda?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I finally see clearly what's been happening. You couldn't have children of your own, so you decided to take mine." "That's not true," Margaret insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "It is true. And I've allowed it for far too long because I wanted James to be happy. But I won't allow it anymore." Later that afternoon, I received an email from James with a photo of the endorsed refund check and a deposit confirmation to my account. The subject line read simply "satisfied." I didn't respond. The money wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that I had finally stood up for myself, had finally stopped accepting the narrative that Margaret and James had constructed, where I was an absent, uninvolved mother who deserved to be replaced. A week later, I launched a blog called Erased Mothers, where I shared my story along with resources for other parents experiencing similar situations. I was careful not to use real names or identifying details, focusing instead on the emotional journey and practical advice for others. To my surprise, the blog quickly gained followers. Women and men from across the country reached out with their own stories of parental alienation of adult children manipulated by others, of the pain of being replaced in their children's lives. A month after the wedding, I received an unexpected visitor, Amanda. She stood nervously on my doorstep, looking younger than I remembered. "May I come in?" she asked hesitantly. I led her to the living room, curious about the purpose of her visit. "James doesn't know I'm here," she began. "Things have been difficult since we got back. Margaret is constantly at our house, giving unsolicited advice, making decisions for us. Last week she redecorated our guest room without asking, saying it needed to be appropriate for when grandchildren visit." I nodded, unsurprised. "That sounds like Margaret." "James can't see it," Amanda continued. "He defends everything she does. We had a huge fight about it yesterday. She twisted her wedding ring nervously. "I found your blog." I froze. My blog. Erased Mothers. It's yours, isn't it? The story is too specific to be coincidence. I didn't deny it. Have you shown it to James? No, she said quickly. But reading it helped me understand what's been happening. The same patterns are starting in our marriage. Margaret inserting herself, James allowing it because she's family, and I'm just, well, the outsider. An unexpected wave of sympathy washed over me. I'm sorry, Amanda. I never wanted my issues with James and Margaret to affect your marriage. It's not your fault, she said firmly. And I didn't come here to complain. I came to tell you that I support what you're doing, standing up for yourself, setting boundaries. She took a deep breath. And to ask if you'd be willing to try family counseling with James, all three of us. I was stunned by the request. Does James want this? Not yet, she admitted. But I'm making it a condition of our moving forward. The patterns have to change, or we won't make it as a couple. As Amanda left, I felt the first glimmer of hope I'd experienced in months. Not hope that things would return to how they were before, that was impossible, but hope that perhaps with professional help and Amanda's insistence, James might begin to see the truth about Margaret's manipulation and my real role in his life. Whether or not James ever agreed to counseling, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow myself to be erased. I had reclaimed my voice, my truth, and most importantly, my self-respect. And no one, not even my only son, could take that away from me again. 6 months after the wedding, I was sitting in my new apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a seniors' community across town. I had sold my house using the equity to bolster my retirement fund and start a small nest egg. The place was smaller but bright and modern, with none of the memories that had haunted my old home. My financial recovery was proceeding slowly but steadily. Beyond the venue refund, James had eventually agreed through his lawyer to repay $7,000 of the wedding costs to be paid in monthly installments over 2 years. It wasn't everything I had spent, but combined with the proceeds from selling the house, it gave me some security. The emotional recovery was more complicated. I had been seeing a therapist named Dr. Rivera, who specialized in family estrangement. Our sessions had helped me understand the dynamics that had led to the rupture with James. You were vulnerable as a single mother, Dr. Rivera explained during one session. Margaret saw that vulnerability and exploited it using her financial advantages to position herself as the better provider for James's needs. But why did James go along with it, I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. Children naturally gravitate toward the path of least resistance and greatest reward, she said gently. Margaret offered material comforts, fewer rules, and constant praise. She never had to be the disciplinarian or say no to him. It was easy for her to be the fun grandmother, while you had to be the responsible parent. Understanding the mechanics of what had happened didn't erase the pain, but it helped me stop blaming myself quite so much. I hadn't failed as a mother. I had been deliberately undermined by someone with more resources and fewer scruples. My blog had grown into a supportive community. I organized monthly virtual meetings for parents experiencing estrangement, bringing in experts to discuss topics like setting boundaries, managing grief, and rebuilding self-worth. The work gave me purpose and connected me with people who truly understood my experience. In October, 6 months after the wedding, I received an email from James. We hadn't spoken since the tense conversation about the refund, though his monthly repayments arrived punctually. Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking. Amanda has been pushing me to look at some family dynamics that aren't healthy. I've started seeing a therapist of my own. I realize now that my words at the wedding were deeply hurtful to you. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. Would you be willing to meet for coffee sometime? I read the email several times, emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to rush to reconcile, to have my son back in my life at any cost. But Dr. Rivera had helped me recognize that pattern as part of the problem. My eagerness to preserve my relationship with James at all costs had enabled his and Margaret's behavior. I replied carefully, "James, I appreciate your apology and your willingness to examine these issues. I would be open to meeting, but I think it would be most productive if it were in the context of family therapy with a neutral professional present. Let me know if that's something you're willing to consider." 3 days later, he agreed. We scheduled a session with a family therapist named Dr. Brennan for the following week. I was anxious, but determined to approach the meeting with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The first session was difficult. James seemed genuinely remorseful about the wedding speech, but struggled to acknowledge the years of allowing Margaret to undermine me. When Dr. Brennan asked about his relationship with his grandmother, he became defensive. "Grandma Margaret has always been there for me," he insisted. "She's been a positive influence in my life." It's possible for Margaret to have been supportive in many ways while still having a negative impact on your relationship with your mother, Dr. Brennan pointed out. These things aren't mutually exclusive. Over the next few sessions, James began to recognize patterns he had never seen before. He brought a box of old cards and letters from Margaret, which often contained subtle digs at me disguised as concern. "I'm so glad I could take James on this college tour, since his mother is always so busy working," one note read. "I worry about how Alicia's financial struggles affect James's sense of security," said another. Seeing these messages through adult eyes, James started to understand how he had been manipulated. "She always made it sound like she was just being helpful," he said during our 4th session. "But now I can see she was constantly implying you weren't enough." And I played into it, I acknowledged. "I was so afraid of losing you that I accepted less and less of a role in your life, which only reinforced the narrative that I wasn't fully present." The real breakthrough came when Amanda joined us for a session and shared her observations of Margaret's behavior since the wedding. She tries to make every decision, from how we decorate our home to where we spend holidays. When I push back, she tells James I'm trying to separate him from his family. James looked stricken. That's exactly what she used to say about Mom. Reconciliation with James was a slow, sometimes painful process. We agreed to monthly family therapy sessions and occasional casual meetings for lunch or coffee. I maintained firm boundaries, making it clear that Margaret could not be present at our meetings, and that I would not tolerate any further attempts to minimize my role in his life. My relationship with Margaret was beyond repair, and I had no desire to mend it. James struggled with this initially, still hoping for one big happy family, but eventually accepted that some bridges cannot and should not be rebuilt. The holidays that year presented the first major test of our new boundaries. James and Amanda invited me to Thanksgiving dinner at their home, assuring me that Margaret would not be present. She would have her time with them the following day. Sitting at their dining table, I felt a mix of emotions: joy at being included, lingering hurt from the past, cautious hope for the future. Amanda had gone out of her way to make me feel welcome, placing me in the position of honor beside James and asking me to bring my famous cranberry relish, a recipe I had created when James was little. "This is delicious," Mom James said after taking a bite. "I'd forgotten how much I love this." "You used to request it even in the middle of summer," I recalled, smiling at the memory. "I did." He looked surprised. I don't remember that. There's probably a lot you don't remember from those early years, I said gently. You were just a child, but I remember everything. After dinner, while Amanda cleared the table, James showed me their wedding album, which had finally arrived. He hesitated before opening it. There are a lot of pictures with Grandma Margaret, he warned. I'm sorry about that. It's okay, I assured him. That was then. We're creating a new now. As we turned the pages, I saw numerous photos where Margaret was prominently featured, often in positions typically reserved for the mother of the groom. It stung, but less sharply than before. The photos were a record of the past, not a predictor of the future. Near the end of the album, James pointed to a photo I hadn't noticed before. It showed me in my blue dress, head thrown back in laughter as I danced with one of his college friends. This is my favorite picture from the whole wedding, he said quietly. You look so happy here, so beautiful. I touched the image, surprised. I don't even remember this moment. It was right after everyone moved to the dance floor, before my speech. He closed the album. I wish I could take it back, Mom, what I said that day. Words spoken can't be unspoken, I said, but new words can be added to the story. That's what we're doing now. By the time the second anniversary of the wedding approached, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My blog had led to speaking engagements at family therapy conferences. I had written a book about parental alienation and estrangement that was being published by a small press. And I had found a community of friends who valued me for exactly who I was. James and I continued our careful rebuilding. There were setbacks, times when old patterns threatened to reemerge, but we were both committed to creating a healthier relationship. Margaret remained a complicated presence in the background, though James had begun to set boundaries with her, as well, recognizing her manipulative tactics for what they were. One spring afternoon, James and Amanda came to visit with news they were expecting a baby. As they shared their excitement, Amanda reached over and squeezed my hand. We want you to be an active grandma, Alicia, present from the beginning. I'd like that very much, I said, emotion welling up. And we've already discussed it, James added. Margaret will be limited to scheduled visits. She won't have the kind of unlimited access she's expecting. I don't want to come between you and your grandmother, I began. This isn't about you versus her, James interrupted. This is about Amanda and me making healthy choices for our family. We've learned from the past. As they left that day, James hugged me tightly. I do know who my real mother is, he whispered. I always have, even when I couldn't admit it. I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you. I held my son, this man who had hurt me so deeply, but was working so hard to make amends. The most valuable lesson I've learned, I told him, is that true family isn't defined by obligation or biology alone. It's built on respect, honesty, and conscious choice. Every day we choose who we want in our lives and how we treat them. I choose you, Mom, he said simply. I choose to have you in my life on new and better terms. Standing in my doorway, watching them drive away, I reflected on the long, painful journey that had brought me to this moment. The $19,000 I spent on that wedding had cost me far more than money, but it had also eventually bought me something priceless. The freedom to value myself, to set boundaries, and to build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than desperate need. If you've ever felt erased by someone you love, remember that your worth isn't determined by their ability to see it. Your story matters even when others try to rewrite it. Have you ever had to rebuild a relationship after a deep betrayal? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, it's never too late to reclaim your voice and your truth.